Certainly, here's an expanded version of that section. Silence isn't just the absence of words, it's the presence of intent. Too often, we misunderstand silence, thinking it's enough to stop talking and withdraw, expecting the other person to decipher the unspoken message. But let me tell you something, silence without meaning is just noise turned down. It's a quiet chaos, a vacuum that can confuse more than it can communicate. It's like sitting in a room with all the lights off, hoping I instinctively know what's in your heart. Silence on its own isn't inherently powerful. What gives silence its weight is the purpose behind it. The why matters more than the what. And if you don't know your why, then your silence is just empty. You might think your silence is making a statement, but without clarity, the only message it sends is confusion. Silence is not some universal language that automatically translates your feelings into understanding. It doesn't carry meaning unless you give it meaning. Think about it. If you've been silent with someone, maybe it's your spouse, your child, your friend, or even your boss, have you ever stopped to consider whether they even understand the reason behind your silence? Because silence that hasn't been preceded by clear communication is not impactful, it's isolating. You can't expect people to feel the weight of what you haven't expressed. They aren't walking around with a telepathic connection to your thoughts and emotions. Some of us are guilty of retreating into silence when we feel unheard. We think if I stop talking, they'll finally pay attention. But in reality, that silence often falls on deaf ears. Why? Because the other person may not even realize they've done something that needs addressing. Or maybe they interpret your silence as disengagement rather than an invitation for change. They may see it as indifference rather than a plea for recognition. And you're sitting there waiting for your silence to shake their world. But they're moving on, unaffected and unaware. Listen to me carefully. Silence that hasn't been built on a foundation of expressed boundaries is just passive resignation. If you've never told someone what you need, if you've never articulated your expectations, how can you expect your silence to convey what your words never did? Silence without clarity is like speaking in a language the other person doesn't understand. It leaves the door open to misinterpretation, and instead of creating change, it creates distance. I'm reminded of the story of Elijah in the Bible. After his victory over the prophets of Baal, he fled to the wilderness, exhausted and feeling defeated. He ended up in a cave, and God came to him not in the wind, not in the earthquake, not in the fire, but in a still small voice. You see, silence can be powerful, but it has to carry substance. It has to carry intent. Elijah didn't hear God in the loudness of his surroundings. He heard him in the clarity of that quiet voice. Silence isn't about the absence of sound, it's about the presence of something deeper. But if your silence is empty, if it's not carrying any message or purpose, it's no different than static on a radio. It's just a pause, a void, and nothing more. And let me tell you something else. Silence without direction doesn't just fail to impact the other person. It also starts to eat away at you. Because while you're waiting for someone to notice your silence, the frustration builds. The resentment grows. You start to feel unappreciated, unseen, unheard, not because they're ignoring your silence, but because they don't even know what it's supposed to be. It's time to stop expecting unspoken words to do the heavy lifting. If you're going to be silent, make sure your silence is backed by intention. Ask yourself, what am I trying to achieve with this silence? Is it healing or is it harm? Is it peace or is it punishment? Because if your silence is a tool of manipulation, it will only breed bitterness. But if your silence is rooted in wisdom, it will foster clarity. Now let me make this plain. Silence can be a tool of peace, but peace requires communication. If you're going to use silence to protect your energy, let the other person know that you're stepping back not to punish, but to preserve your well-being. If you're silent because you're processing your emotions, let them know that you need space, not because they don't matter, but because you're trying to find the right words. That's the difference between silence that heals and silence that hurts. Don't confuse silence with surrender. And don't confuse stillness with stagnation. Silence can be an act of strength, but only when it's paired with self-awareness. When Jesus stood silent before his accusers, it wasn't because he didn't have anything to say. It was because he knew who was. He didn't need to defend himself because he understood that his purpose was greater than the opinions of others. That's the kind of silence that transforms lives, not the silence of defeat, but the silence of understanding. So the next time you feel the urge to withdraw into silence, ask yourself, what am I trying to communicate? If you can't answer that question, then your silence isn't ready to speak yet. Take the time to find your voice even in the quiet. Because when your silence carries meaning, it's no longer just noise turned down. It becomes a force that speaks louder than words ever could. Let me tell you something that might make you uncomfortable. The silent treatment is not the same as silence with power. They may look similar on the surface, but they are rooted in two completely different intentions. The silent treatment is often born from frustration, resentment, or pride. It is a weapon, not a tool way to punish someone by withholding communication, by creating a wall instead of a bridge. On the other hand, silence with power is rooted in strength, wisdom, and clarity. It isn't a reaction to someone else's behavior. It's a response that comes from knowing your own worth and protecting your peace. When you give someone the silent treatment, the goal is often to make them feel guilty, to make them miss your presence, or to force them to recognize the pain they've caused. But let me ask you this, does it really work? Does it bring healing? Does it create understanding? Or does it just breed more frustration, more distance, and more confusion? You see, the silent treatment is not a solution, it's a symptom. It's a symptom of unresolved hurt, unspoken expectations, and the need for control. It doesn't solve problems, it only prolongs them. The silent treatment is a form of manipulation. It's saying, I won't talk to you until you figure out what you did wrong. The reality is, most people don't have the emotional radar to decode your silence. They don't know if you're hurt, angry, or indifferent, or left guessing. And while you might think your silence is teaching them a lesson, all it's really doing is creating more confusion. And while they're confused, you're growing more frustrated because they're not responding the way you hoped. It becomes a vicious cycle of misunderstanding and unmet expectations. But silence with power is different. Silence with power isn't about controlling the other person, it's about controlling yourself. It's about recognizing that not every situation requires a reaction. It's about stepping back, not to punish, but to preserve your energy and your peace. When you choose silence with power, you're not ignoring the other person, you're prioritizing your own well-being. You're choosing to disengage from chaos, not as a means of avoidance, but as an act of self-respect. Let's take a look at Jesus as an example. When he stood before Pilate, being accused and questioned, he chose silence. Not because he had nothing to say, but because he had nothing to prove. His silence was powerful because it wasn't rooted in fear or anger, it was rooted in purpose. He knew who he was. He knew his mission. He didn't need to argue or defend himself because his silence spoke volumes. That is the kind of silence that shifts atmospheres. Silence with power says, I don't need to explain myself to be at peace. It says, I'm stepping back not because I'm weak, but because I'm strong enough to protect my spirit. It says, I'm choosing to rise above the noise because my purpose is too important to be distracted by petty arguments. That kind of silence is not about withholding communication. It's about choosing the right time, the right place, and the right way to communicate. Now let's talk about the impact. The silent treatment often leaves the other person feeling rejected, confused, or even resentful. It doesn't foster connection, it creates a wedge. But silence with power leaves room for reflection. It doesn't slam the door shut, it leaves it slightly ajar, inviting the other person to step through when they're ready to meet you with mutual respect and understanding. Silence with power says, I'm here, but I'm not engaging in anything that disrupts my peace. Here's the thing. Silence with power requires a more maturity. It requires you to pause and ask yourself, why am I being silent? If your silence is coming from a place of pride, it's not power, it's avoidance. If your silence is coming from a place of anger, it's not power, it's punishment. But if your silence is coming from a place of clarity, where you know your boundaries and you're protecting your peace, then it becomes a powerful tool for growth. It also requires you to communicate your silence. Now that might sound counterintuitive, but hear me out. Silence with power doesn't mean you leave the other person guessing. It means you let them know where you stand, even if you're choosing not to engage at the moment. You might say, I need some time to process my thoughts before we talk. Or I'm stepping back because this conversation isn't productive right now. That kind of communication isn't weakness, it's strength. It shows that your silence isn't about punishing them. It's about prioritizing yourself. But let me caution you, silence with power doesn't mean you stop showing up for the relationship. It doesn't mean you abandon the conversation altogether. It means you're taking a pause, not hitting the stop button. Silence with power creates space for healing and understanding, but that space has to eventually be filled with honest communication. Otherwise, silence becomes a wall instead of a window. So how do you shift from the silent treatment to silence with power? It starts with self-awareness. Ask yourself, am I being silent to make a point? Or am I being silent to find peace? If it's the former, you're still operating from a place of pride or hurt. If it's the latter, you're stepping into a place of wisdom. Then, take the next step and communicate your intentions. Let the other person know your silence is not about shutting them out, but about creating space for growth. Remember this, the silent treatment is about control, but silence with power is about freedom. And when you embrace the kind of silence that is rooted in self-worth and clarity, you don't just create peace for yourself, you invite others to rise to that same level of understanding. Silence with power is not the absence of words. It's the presence of wisdom. It's not about withholding love. It's about setting boundaries that honor love for yourself and love for others. And that kind of silence, my friend, has the power to transform everything. Silence, when paired with action, becomes one of the most transformative tools you can wield. Too often we confuse silence with inactivity. We think that being silent means we're supposed to sit still, wait, and hope for change to fall into our laps. But let me tell you something powerful. Silence without movement is stagnation. Silence that is not paired with progress is just a void. Silence only carries weight when it is backed by intentional action that moves you closer to your purpose. There's a misconception that silence in and of itself is enough to make an impact. That if you simply stop speaking, someone else will start listening. That if you withdraw, someone will step forward to fill the gap. But that's not how it works. Silence can only speak when it's reinforced by what you do. If your actions don't align with your silence, then your silence becomes empty. It loses its meaning. Let me explain it like this. Silence is a tool, but it's not the whole toolbox. Imagine a craftsman who decides to use a hammer but doesn't pair it with nails or wood. The hammer might be powerful, but without the other tools, it can't build anything. Silence is the same way. It's a part of the process, but it needs to be accompanied by forward motion, by intentional decisions, by meaningful action. Think about a seed planted in the ground. The seed doesn't shout as it grows. It doesn't announce its progress to the world. Its growth happens in silence, but it's not stagnant. Beneath the soil, the roots are pushing deeper, finding strength and echoing themselves. Above the soil, the stem is reaching toward the light. The silence of the seed is paired with action, and that's why it transforms into a tree. In the same way, your silence has to be paired with work. If you're silent about your frustrations with someone but don't take steps to change the dynamic, your silence is wasted. If you're silent and you're waiting but aren't preparing yourself for what's next, then your silence isn't serving you. Silence has power when it's active, not passive. Let me give you an example from life. Imagine you're in a relationship and you've decided to stop arguing, to stop explaining yourself, to stop trying to convince the other person of your worth. That's a good step. Choosing peace over conflict is always wise. But if you stop there, your silence won't have the impact you want it to have. If your silence isn't accompanied by boundaries, self-reflection, and growth, then it's just a pause, not progress. The other person may not even notice your silence because it hasn't changed anything. But when your silence is paired with action, when you set boundaries, when you invest in yourself, when you take steps to heal and grow, that's when your silence starts to speak. It sends a clear message, not because of the absence of your words, but because of the presence of your actions. It says, I'm not engaging in this argument because I'm too busy working on myself. I'm not explaining myself because I'm too focused on walking in my purpose. I'm not trying to change you because I'm committed to changing me. Even in the Bible, we see this principle in action. Think about the woman with the issue of blood. She didn't speak. She didn't shout. She didn't demand attention. Her silence was paired with movement. She pressed through the crowd, quietly but determinedly, until she touched the hem of Jesus' garment. Her silence, combined with her faith and her action, brought her healing. She didn't need to announce her intentions because her actions spoke louder than any words could have. The same applies to your life. If you're waiting for something to change, don't just sit in silence. Use that silence as a time to prepare, to work, to grow. If you're waiting for a new job, use the silence to learn a new job, to refine your resume, to build your network. If you're waiting for a relationship to improve, use the silence to reflect on your own patterns, to seek wisdom, to invest in your own happiness. If you're waiting for clarity about your purpose, use the silence to pray, to journal, to take small steps toward what feels right. Silence isn't about doing nothing, it's about doing the right things in a quiet, intentional way. It's about planting seeds and trusting that they'll grow, even when you don't see immediate results. It's about aligning your actions with your goals so that your silence becomes a foundation, not a barrier. Or let me tell you this, action doesn't always have to be loud or visible. Sometimes the most powerful actions happen behind the scenes. It's the work you do when no one is watching. It's the discipline to show up for yourself day after day, even when no one is applauding. It's the quiet decision to choose growth over comfort, purpose over distraction, faith over fear. When your silence is paired with action, it shifts the focus from the other person to yourself. It's no longer about making someone else notice you or feel the weight of your absence. It's about making yourself stronger, wiser, and more aligned with your purpose. And here's the beautiful thing. When you focus on your own growth, the world around you starts to shift. People notice the changes in you. Opportunities start to align with your progress. The silence you once used to retreat becomes the silence you now use to rebuild. So, the next time you find yourself in a season of silence, don't let it be idle. Pair it with action. Use it to plant seeds. Use it to prepare for what's coming. Because silence, when it's paired with movement, becomes a force that can't be ignored. It speaks not just in whispers, but in the undeniable language of transformation. And that kind of silence is unstoppable. Silence is one of the most underestimated forces in the world. But when it is rooted in self-worth, it becomes a roar that cannot be ignored. Too often, silence is mistaken for weakness or indifference, but the truth is, when it comes from a place of confidence and self-respect, silence can say more than words ever could. It's not about shutting people out or avoiding confrontation. It's about knowing your value so deeply that you don't feel the need to explain, defend, or prove yourself to anyone. When silence is rooted in self-worth, it's no longer a passive act, it's a deliberate choice. It's saying, I know who I am and I don't need external validation to confirm it. It's the kind of silence that speaks to your unshakable confidence, your understanding of your own boundaries, and your refusal to engage in anything that diminishes your peace or sense of self. This silence doesn't come from insecurity or a desire to manipulate. It comes from strength. It comes from understanding that not every battle is worth fighting, and not every opinion deserves a response. Think about it, how often do we waste energy trying to convince people of our worth? We explain ourselves, defend ourselves, and argue with people who were never really listening in the first place. And what does it accomplish? Usually nothing but frustration and exhaustion. But when you operate from a place of self-worth, you realize that your value isn't up for debate. You don't need to argue about it, because it's not contingent on someone else's approval. That's when silence becomes your loudest statement. This kind of silence can be incredibly disarming. When someone expects you to argue, to justify yourself, or to react emotionally, your silence sends a powerful message. It says, I'm not playing by your rules. I don't need to prove anything to you. It forces the other person to confront the emptiness of their words or actions, because your silence refuses to give them the reaction they were looking for. It creates space for reflection, both for you and for them. And in that space, clarity often emerges. Let me give you an example. Imagine you're in a situation where someone is criticizing you, belittling you, or trying to provoke you. The instinct might be to fight back, to defend yourself, or to explain why they're wrong. But when your silence is rooted in self-worth, you don't feel the need to engage. You can look at the situation and think, this isn't about me, it's about them. Your silence becomes a shield protecting you from their negativity and allowing you to maintain your peace. But silence rooted in self-worth isn't just about what you don't do, it's also about what you do. It's about redirecting the energy you might have spent on arguments and instead using it to invest in yourself. It's about stepping away from toxic situations and stepping toward things that nourish you. It's about choosing to focus on your growth, your goals, and your happiness rather than wasting time trying to change someone else's opinion of you. This kind of silence also speaks volumes in relationships. When you know your worth, you don't tolerate disrespect or mistreatment. You don't beg for attention, chase after people, or cling to relationships that drain you. Your silence in these moments says, I deserve better, and I'm not afraid to walk away to protect my peace. It's not about being cold or distant, it's about honoring yourself enough to set boundaries and enforce them. And when people see that you're willing to walk away, rather than compromise your self-respect, they realize just how much strength your silence holds. One of the most beautiful aspects of silence, rooted in self-worth, is that it allows you to listen more deeply yourself to others in the world around you. When you're not constantly trying to prove yourself or fill the space with words, you can tune into what really matters. You can hear your own intuition guiding you toward what aligns with your values and purpose. You can hear the unspoken needs of others, allowing you to respond with empathy rather than defensiveness. And you can hear the quiet opportunities that arise when you're not too busy talking to notice them. Silence rooted in self-worth is also deeply freeing. It releases you from the need to control how others perceive you. You no longer feel the need to explain your choices, your boundaries, or your path. You realize that not everyone will understand you, and that's okay. Your job isn't to make everyone see your value, it's to live in alignment with it. And when you do that, the right people will recognize it without you having to say a word. But let me be clear, this kind of silence doesn't happen overnight. It takes work. It takes unlearning the patterns of people pleasing, over-explaining, and seeking validation. It takes building a deep, unshakable relationship with yourself so you know your worth even when others try to make you doubt it. And it takes courage, the courage to stand firm in your silence, even when it feels uncomfortable, even when others don't understand it. Silence rooted in self-worth is not about shutting down or withdrawing from the world. It's about standing tall in your own truth, unshaken by the opinions or actions of others. It's about knowing that your worth is inherent, unchangeable, and not up for negotiation. And when you operate from that place, your silence becomes a statement of confidence, of peace, and of power. It becomes a reminder to the world that sometimes the loudest thing you can do is say nothing at all. And in that silence, your value echoes louder than words ever could.